Guten Tag, WAP. This is Mr. Liniger. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 2, Day 13. Let's get started with our daily punishment. I knew a guy who collected candy canes. They were all in mint condition. Key terms for today are jihad, Atlantic slave trade, the triangle trade, Middle Passage, polygamy, Eladio Equiano, and Frederick Douglass. Today, we're going to go over the social and economic changes in Africa as a result of European exploration, the impact on Africa in the early modern period, and African resistance to slavery and the effects of slavery during the early modern period. Let's talk about some of the social changes in Africa. Social groups and changes. Kinship and clans will remain unchanged. You'll still have a lot of kinship and tribal significance. Traditions will tend to remain unchanged. You will see hereditary monarchies who will be involved in the slave trade in West Africa and will get guns as a result. Islam will become radicalized during this time in the Sahel states. There'll be some jihads and religious radicalism against European states. You will see some American food crops in Africa, like manioc, maize, which is corn, peanuts, yams, and melons. And this is going to lead to a pretty big population growth in Africa from 35 million to 60 million from 1500 to 1800, which is pretty impressive because like a lot of the people from Africa in the Saharan region were enslaved and sent to the Americas, but the population is going to grow regardless of that because of the new food crops and the high calorie intake. Let's talk about the slave trade. Slavery was common in Iberian society, like Spain and Portugal. Slavery was common in traditional African society. Islam already did a slave trade throughout North Africa. There are different routes the slave trade took. There was the North Africa to the Middle East slave trade, Indian Ocean to Middle Eastern slave trade. And the big one, which is going to become a big deal now, is going to be the slave trade where they're taken from West Africa and they're sent to the Americas. This is called the Atlantic slave trade. The voyage of them going from Africa to the Americas is called the Middle Passage. And the whole slave trade route is called the triangular trade. That's how like the Europeans buy the slaves from Africa in return for like they give them gold and guns. The slaves are sent to the Americas and they produce raw resources there like cotton and textiles. Those raw resources are then sent back to Europe where they're used in factories to become things like clothing, candy, cigarettes, and then it goes on again and again. This is just a map of the transatlantic slave trade. As you can see here, a majority of the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and Brazil. Those were the areas where they used the most for the plantations, and those were the areas where they had the harshest slave conditions. I do want to make clear right now that slavery, although common in previous societies, was different. In African traditional society, you would capture enemy tribal soldiers, but their children were not slaves. There was no social stigma about it, and often your children were not slaves. Even the Islamic slave trade, it was to a much smaller extent. They didn't create like a racial system out of it. It's not going to be as big. The European Atlantic slave trade is going to be the horrendous. Not only will a lot of slaves die in the Middle Passage, the Europeans will create a racial idea from it, that the Africans were inferior. They're going to make it hereditary, and it really leads to the beginning of racism. So let's talk about the slave trade some more. The Portuguese are going to explore the coastal areas of Africa, West Africa, East Africa, at first Southern Africa. They establish factories and trading stations there. Diseases will keep the Europeans out of the interior Africa. They cooperate with local rulers. They often give them gold and guns in return for slaves or other goods. The Africans get manufactured goods. The Portuguese will dominate the shipment and demand out of Africa. The early slave trade on the Atlantic started by the Portuguese in 1441. American planters are going to need labor for a variety of reasons that we've talked about before. The Amerindians will not be able to be the slave labor system, so they're going to start importing African slaves into the Americas. We're going to have the triangular trade, which we talked about. In Africa, finished goods are going to be traded for slaves. In the Americas, slaves traded for sugar and molasses. In Europe, the American produce was traded. At every stage, the slave trade was brutal. The Middle Passage was the voyage from Africa to the Americas. Between 25 to 50% died on the passage. Another 25% would die within the first year. Let's talk about some of the impacts of the slave trade on Africa. It's going to increase dramatically after 1600. 12 million slaves are brought to the Americas. 4 million die en route, which is a freaking genocide. On the Muslim slave trade, there was 10 million people, but that was over like a 1,000-year period, which doesn't make it right, but like, I don't want to make it seem like the Atlantic slave trade was not as bad. It was significantly worse than the Islamic slave trade. There's going to be some big social impacts of the slave trade. It's going to distort the African sex ratio. A lot of the men were the ones sent to the Americas, so there's going to be a lot more women than men in Africa. Because of this, polygamy will be encouraged and common. One of the byproducts of the European slave trade was polygamy. Women also take on men's duties. There will be political and economic disruption. Some of those kingdoms like Oyo, Asante, and Dahomey are trading slaves for guns. This will lead to war and new state formation. A lot of these African kingdoms will fail to develop economies, industry, and trade beyond the slave trade. So one of the byproducts of the Atlantic slave trade is the European states economically fragment and cause the African economy to fail to develop. Plantations are going to be racially divided. Some of the bigger plantations have 100 or more slaves with a few white supervisors. The whites were on the top of the social pyramid in the Americas. Then you have the free people of color. Then you have mulattoes. You have saltwater slaves. Those slaves that directly came from Africa. There's going to be high death rates in the Caribbean and Brazil. This causes them to import more and more slaves. Most slaves came to the Caribbean, like Haiti and Brazil. Only 5% of the slaves came to North America, less than 1% to the US. Slave families will be common, although in a lot of these countries, they're going to start to pass slave code laws where they don't recognize slave marriages. Africans will bring with them their traditions and cultures. Religions will also be combined through different cultures. African Christianity is going to be a blend of African traditional beliefs and Christianity. It's going to be syncretism. So one of the examples of that is like Pentecostal behavior. When you chant something, they chant it back. Can I get it? Amen. Amen. That's responsorial. That's something you see in Pentecostal Christianity, and that's originally an African belief. Ritual drumming, singing. In some areas, you're going to get another religion called Vodon, V-O-D-O-N, like voodoo. And that's going to use some Christian beliefs with animal sacrifice, magic, sorcery. You'll see that in the Caribbean. Some of the other cultural traditions we'll see are hybrid cuisines, weaving, pottery. There will be some resistance to slavery. Some of the examples that slaves resisted are this. They could purposely go slow in their work, get the slows, sabotage their work, try to escape. There will be slave revolts. They will be rare, but they will be slave revolts. We talked about the Stono Rebellion before. There'll be things like Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner's Rebellion. The most successful slave rebellion will happen in the Haiti, led by Toussaint L'Ouverture, where he will rebel against the French and create the first African former slave country. Also, the Enlightenment will turn some people against slavery. The Enlightenment focused on rationalism and individual rights. The American and French Revolution will also kind of make some people very uncomfortable with slavery because of its idea of equality. We'll start to see slave journals. These are books written by former slaves. The two most famous examples of this are Oludu Equiano, who was a former slave, and he wrote an autobiography and became a bestseller. He also is going to help in England. He's from England. He's going to lead the law to get the slave trade banned. The example in America, which most of you have probably heard of, is Frederick Douglass. He was a slave. He ran away, and he's going to become one of the most famous abolitionists. He wrote The Life of Frederick Douglass. He helped form the Republican Party and supported the North during the Civil War. Slavery will become increasingly costly during the 1800s. You'll see the decline of sugar prices, the rising cost of slaves in the late 18th century. The slave trade will be banned by most countries in the early 19th century and the early 1800s. After this, slavery will slowly be abolished. The last couple of countries to abolish slavery will be America, 1863, technically 1865 if you want to count the 13th Amendment, or if you want to count the Emancipation Proclamation. And then Brazil is going to be the last one in the 1880s. All right, guys, that's all I got for you today. Until next time, deuces, deuces, deuces.